Chapter 6 Starting Over. When I arrived back home, I quickly reconnected with all my good friends and family. It was good to get home to family and feel that sense of community that I never experienced in Oregon. I took that entire summer off trying to put off the inevitable, my future. The options were simple: either get a full-time job or go back to school. After weighing my choices, I decided to enroll at an area technical college with hopes of getting a degree in computer-aided drafting, or CAD. I thought this might be a job I could perform well and enjoy, and more importantly, it would keep my parents, especially my mother, off my back. The next year and a half of my life was spent going to school full-time and working part-time. I struggled with many of my classes, with the exception of psychology, which I found fascinating. Due to my natural interest in psych, I probably should have changed my ambitions immediately right then and there, but because of my lack of confidence and self-awareness, I failed to do so. For the time being, I would continue on my present path at school and work my tolerable part-time job, all the while obsessing over my appearance. I had yet to find that special someone, and because of that was becoming more and more depressed. And when you're 20-something, single, celibate, and living with your mom, you start to think there's something seriously wrong with you. I was one very unhappy individual. Fortunately, I had a small but solid support system made up of a few good friends, which also included God, who I was now beginning to lean on more and more. This support network was critical to me and is what would pull me through these rather difficult and strenuous times. For my New Year's resolution, I quit drinking alcohol, which I already did very little of by this time. Then in February, I made the monumental decision to drop out of college. The more time I spent learning about CAD, the more I realized it wasn't something I wanted to do for a career. As you might imagine, this went over like a lead balloon with my parents, especially my mother, who basically hit the roof. I will never forget the conversation that night. It was a no-holds-barred debate that allowed us both to, once and for all, clear the air and speak our minds without fear or apprehension. It was also the kind of conversation where no one walked away feeling particularly good about what was spoken. Still, it was very important for us to have this conversation at that point in time. I could understand my mother's concern, but at the same time, I had to remind her that it was my life and not hers, and that I had to be happy with the direction I was taking, or else risk being an unhappy, unfulfilled person, which I basically was. You should like what you do, just like you need to love who you're with. Still, it was painful as anything because the last thing I wanted to do was disappoint my parents. For years, I had this "what are you going to do with your life" monkey on my back, and now it was time for me to shed that burden, find myself, and finally start being true to myself. Dropping out of college was a watershed event in my life because it allowed me to put myself squarely on an artistic and spiritual path that I am still on today. My first order of business was to get back into playing the drums. As time passed and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I am simply a person who was cut from an artist's cloth, thanks in large part to my father's side of the family. It's who I am and what I am. Unfortunately, this was a reality that my mother simply could not embrace or accept. But because music and art were the things I was most passionate about, it only made sense that I should pursue a career within those realms. I immediately bought a set of drums from a musician friend of mine, having sold my original kit when I moved out west. I also rented a shed from the same friend and started studying and practicing my instrument with a purpose. I even started taking drum lessons at a local music store, but those didn't last very long because, once again, I preferred learning on my own terms and at my own tempo. No pun intended. My other goal at this time was to deepen my relationship with God. This was critical for me considering all the changes I was going through, especially the tension I was feeling with my mother. I would accomplish this in a personal way with individual communion with God, and socially during the Sunday morning study meetings I was attending again. I had been bodybuilding for quite some time, but it was high time that I start doing some serious soul building. That fall, I signed up for classes at a local community college that specialized in liberal arts, but this time it would be for subjects that I wanted to study, art and music. The other fall study on my agenda would be to read from cover to cover all 2,097 pages of the Blue Book that was the subject of our Sunday morning study group. Every day after my classes, I would go straight to the school library to read from this book for 1 full hour. I was feeling really good about the progress I was making in my life, with the exception of 2 areas: my life at home and the fact that I was still single. Life at home, since I dropped out of technical college, was becoming increasingly tense and was fast reaching the point of being intolerable. My mother was not at all happy with the direction my life was going in and let me know this on an almost daily basis. It was getting to the point where I could no longer take it, and I knew something would have to give. Since my parents weren't going anywhere, it was becoming painfully obvious that I had to leave home, and fast. Chapter 7: Freedom, Sweet Freedom. In November, I got the opportunity to rent a small house that was owned by a good friend's mother in a neighboring town not far from our family home. It cost a whopping $300 a month. It was just what the doctor ordered. The best thing about this house was that I could play my drums there, which was one of the few gratifying things I had going on in my life at that time. With great fervor and determination, I began to reshape and refresh the interior of this rather small dwelling, which was in pretty rough shape due to the previous occupant. Regardless, I turned it into my new personal holy sanctuary. After a little money and a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears, I created a home that reflected who I was. There was impressionistic art on the walls, a decent amount of vinyl records, my stereo, an exercise machine, and my drums. And oh yeah, it also had a bathroom and a place to eat. It would be a new decade of freedom, independence, self-reliance, and hopefully greater happiness. I would officially move in on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1990. I began this new decade with a great deal of optimism. I was not using marijuana anymore, as it was my New Year's resolution not to do so. Thus, my mind was sharp, clear, and focused. And as hard as it was to be alone on this new journey, I was free and independent to pursue what I believed was my destiny, which was to be an artist/musician. I knew it would be hard, and I knew I'd probably be hungry, but it was the one thing besides God that I was passionate and serious about. This would be a time of determination and discipline, and I was ready for it. My daily routine was strict and as follows: 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. breakfast. 8 a.m. to 8:30 a.m. breakfast. 8:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. book study. 10 a.m. to 12 noon drum practice. 12 noon to 12:30 p.m. lunch break. 12:30 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. drum practice. 3:45 to 8:30 p.m. work. 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. exercise, prayer, and worship. My daily routine, difficult as it was at times, was yielding some real nutritious spiritual fruit. My relationship with God and my understanding of God was growing deeper and deeper by the day. I was feeling healthier physically, and my proficiency as a drummer was becoming greater. As my mind and thinking was expanding, so too were my ears. The heavy metal and pop music of the 1980s had run their course for me, as well as millions of other listeners, but instead of turning to the newer sounds of grunge rock and rap, I discovered the beauty and emotion of 1960s jazz, folk, and blues music. They became my alternative music, and with what little extra money I had, I would scour used record stores trying to obtain vintage vinyl LPs that were fairly plentiful at that time due to the advent of the compact disc. Life was good. I had my little home, my drums, my records, God, and one or two close friends. And although it was a very lonely period in my life, it was also a very constructive one. The absence of a soulmate in my life left a hole in my being that no one else, not even God, was capable of filling. Not a single day went by that I wasn't thinking about finding her. Over the years, I had several opportunities to engage in relationships with women, even sexual relations. But as tempting as it might have been, and as sexually charged as I was at that time, unless the girl was someone I could see myself with long term, sex was out of the question. I simply could not bring myself to take advantage of a girl who I didn't have real and deep feelings for, especially considering my recent spiritual growth. In my mind, sex equaled commitment. At this point in my life, when it came to finding that special someone, it would be all or nothing at all. In April, I was laid off from my part-time job and forced to look for work. After painting my parents' home, I began pounding the pavement in search of permanent full-time employment. After scuffling for a few weeks, I walked into a local family-owned and operated automotive supply store to see if they needed any driver help. Thinking back to my driving days at the printed circuit board company, this would be something I could see myself doing long term. As fate would have it, they needed someone to fill that position, and I was quickly hired as a full-time delivery driver. Little did I know at that time that this would be a job I would keep to this day, and would lead to an event that would completely change my life. I quickly settled into my new driving job, which was perfect for the unskilled, uneducated artist that I was. It was rather simple and relatively stress-free, which allowed me ample time to think and dream. I could also listen to local sports talk and news, but most importantly, it gave me the opportunity to meet a wealth of new and interesting people. I also developed a strong friendship with one of my co-workers, Scott, who happened to be the owner's grandson. After work, we would take out his boat and go fishing or tubing, or go to my little house to listen to the blues, which was his favorite genre of music. Over time, we became the best of friends, and still are even to this day. Chapter 8: Losing My Father. Things had been going great that summer when out of the blue tragedy struck. My father, who was working overseas as a shoe consultant, fainted due to his blood sugar level and severely hit his head. The blow struck the steel plate in his skull that was surgically placed there because of injuries sustained in the war. He quickly lapsed into a coma. My mother, sister, and I had a family meeting to discuss what our options were and what needed to be done. I remember expressing to my mother that we should, quote, let him go, take him off life support, while he was still in Thailand. My reasoning was that if his soul had departed his body and had moved on, then there was no need to keep his physical body alive. And if his soul had not departed, we would be keeping his conscious mind a prisoner trapped in his paralyzed body, much like the soldier in the 1971 film Johnny Got His Gun, that depicts a World War I soldier whose conscious thinking mind is trapped within his paralyzed body. I somehow envisioned that this would become my father's fate for years to come, and it broke my heart. I knew God intimately, and within that relationship was completely confident that his life would be everlasting, and that by letting him go, my father would be free from his infirmities. But it was ultimately my mother's decision, and she, along with my sister, decided that someone should fly out to Thailand and bring him back to the States, where he would hopefully make a full recovery. There were many reasons why my mother could not bring herself to release my father from this world, and it would take a long time for me to understand the reasons why. After the decision was made to bring him home, my brother, from my father's first marriage in 1946, volunteered to fly out to Thailand and bring my father home. Upon returning home, my father was admitted into an area VA hospital and placed on life support. This is where he would spend the remainder of his life. Chapter 9: Love at First Night. On a Friday night in late September, my new friend Scott dropped by my little house to show me a purchase he had just made. With him were his longtime girlfriend Carolyn and her sister Catherine. They only stayed a short while, and I thought little of it. We made plans to get together, all four of us, the following night for dinner. It was a casual get-together, not intended to be any kind of a setup, although Carolyn thought I should get to know her sister because we had quite a bit in common. Little did she know how much. As the night progressed and we had a chance to get acquainted, we both started to realize how much we really did have in common. It wasn't just the casual, we both like chocolate similarities that struck us. It was the deeper core values that we shared and how we both felt about serious issues that made our time that night together so compelling and intriguing. Now, that's not to say I wasn't physically attracted to her, because I most definitely was, but this went far beyond that. It was her depth and beauty from within that made her so attractive to me and unlike any woman I had ever met in my life. And to top it all off, she was spiritually minded as well. That night, something very real was happening between us, and we both knew it. But there was one problem. She already had a significant other. When I got home that night, all I could think about was this amazing woman. She was beautiful, kind, strong, thoughtful, and intelligent, but the fact that she had a longtime boyfriend made her absolutely off limits. I was reminded of my earlier experience of seeing someone who was involved with someone else, and all the trouble that had caused, so there was no way I was going down that road again. I'm sure she wouldn't have either. Besides that, it was just morally wrong. The four of us got together a few days later to hang out, and again there was an undeniable chemistry between us. At one point in the evening, our eyes briefly met and we smiled and quickly looked the other way. Once again, I would have to ignore my thoughts and feelings. A week or so later, I heard a knock at my door, and it was Catherine. She wanted to know if I would be willing to make her a mixtape from my vinyl record collection, and I enthusiastically replied, "Sure, we can work on it together." She came over to my little house later that day, and we began to select songs to record. It was a lot of fun. It also gave us a chance to talk about a wide range of topics. One of the subjects we discussed in depth was the relationship with her boyfriend and how it had been slowly disintegrating for quite some time. She told me she didn't know how to end it. All I could say to her was, "Follow your heart and trust where it takes you," hoping all the while that it would lead her straight to me. The next time I talked to Catherine, just a few days later, she told me that she had ended the relationship with her boyfriend. That night by candlelight, we both opened our hearts and expressed how each of us truly felt about the other. It was no surprise that we both had virtually the same feelings for one another, and on that night we officially fell in love. I remember driving to work the next day looking around and thinking to myself, the whole world looks different. For myself, finding my soulmate and life partner was very much like finding God. It was something so sure, so real, and so right, and an experience that was impossible to deny. Like my childhood belief in God, I always believed she existed, but to what degree I had no idea. And after so many years of wondering and hoping and waiting, my belief finally became a full-fledged, living reality. And once again, as it is so many times the case, patience paid off. It is true, good things come to those who wait.